Okay, you're live.
Okay, hopefully people can see me. Welcome. This is the last panel of what has been kind of a fairly, I think, remarkable 3 days of presentations. I don't want to take up much more time. The thematic for our kind of wrap-up session is grasping the big picture, and we have 3 panelists. We have John Eason, Ashley Rubin, and we have Jonathan Simon, and I will moderate questions at the end, and then I'll just say a couple wrap-up comments about the entire event. So I'll turn it over to John, and thank you very much.
I've heard you guys have had a wonderful, wonderful time with technology. I want to make sure you're not seeing my notes and you're only seeing the screen, the title screen that I'm projecting.
We do see the
We're
notes.
seeing your notes.
You're seeing my notes. Of course you are. Of course, I'm the guy that causes this. Hold on, I might have to disconnect something. 1 second. Gonna take me a second. Okay, let me try this one more time. Share screen. And
oh, you're good.
you seeing my notes?
No, we
I'm
don't.
good. Okay, I have to go to an course thing. All right, so I want to thank you guys for inviting me. This is both an honor and a privilege. I was remarking with my fellow panelists before, right before the session, how this is an exciting time and a lot of exciting people to be here discussing our work with. So I want to thank you again for the invitation. The title of my talk today is In Our Backyard, and it's the title of the book I'm working on, and it reframes the pit me, please in my backyard question I posed in my first book, Big House on the Prairie, by offering new theories of prison building using data on all U.S. census places and all prisons ever built in the U.S. to investigate the mechanisms causing prison building, along with the multiple and conflicting ways prisons impact the political economy of local towns, counties, and states. So by expanding the scope and scale of prison building, this inquiry will serve as a definitive work on one of the most pressing social problems of our time, prison proliferation, or the widespread expansion of prison. I'll be tying the legacy of slavery and racial violence of Jim Crow to modern political economy and the underdevelopment in the South in particular in this book. And so while the power of the past systems of racial domination and violence are salient, they cannot explain why the US tripled prison facilities. Instead, I offer the rural ghetto born out of the historical legacy of racial violence as a modern incarnation of oppression in the rural South. Despite the growing significance of prison reform that continues to make the forefront of even our latest presidential debate, the scale of incarceration, the extensive and entrenched system of monetary sanctions, the mass supervision, or what Rubin Miller calls the supervised society, and the footprint of our prison system, or our carceral capacity, what Heather Schoenfeld calls the resources dedicated to detecting, apprehending, processing, and punishing people deemed criminal. These things have all been significant in how we got to nearly 1,700 prisons. So with all of that being said, it seems quite overwhelming over the last couple of days, the last 3 days. We've seen glimmers of hope where people have tried to say, oh, this is how we'll be able to overcome this system of what many believe is racial and economic oppression. But for myself, I stumbled across a keen insight provided by a key informant as I rewrote, summarized my book for this piece in Dissent that was published last year. And John Alderson argued, if we could cite a high-tech, non-polluting facility that pays 100 grand a year instead of a prison, we would have. Heck, I've got the land, I'll sell it to them. But those facilities were not exactly lining up to come to places like Forest City. So my presentation today is a compilation of academic work and a recapping of my research agenda with an eye towards the future. I'm going to end in a flurry, giving you a lot of empirical evidence. So the prison construction requires more than concrete and stone. Given the history of racial and economic exploitation of this peculiar institution, some are convinced blood and bodies form the bedrock, making prisons the ultimate form of racial and economic exploitation. Many are certain prison building is a corrupt political process rife with blood money from privatization. This view is supported in part by the exponential increase in US correction spending over the past 5 decades. The standard story explaining prison proliferation is that private prison operators hope perverse incentives to increase mass incarceration for profit. Part of what clouds our view of prison building is the farm pictured here. The farm is Angola Prison. This is a former slave plantation that now operates as a prison. This is state-owned and operated in Louisiana. That is used to symbolize what is wrong with private prisons. Again, this is state-owned and operated facility used to demonstrate what is wrong with private prisons, right? And so this picture here, who can blame one for clouding these, for confusing privatization and whether or not it's dominant in prison building, given the history of prisons in our country? This is a Time magazine cover from 1977 in Angola. This is a more recent photo from 2016, also at Angola. This certainly looks a lot like a slave line. But using the work of L.B. Eason, her book on privatization, I have a piece in the Conversation last year where I described what the real evil around private prisons is. It's not private prisons per se as much as it is privatization. The same profit motives driving prison privatization is also believed to be the impetus behind the prison boom, or the tripling of US facilities since 1970. Given this proliferation during the purported post-racial era, there's a consensus that the modern prison is interchangeable with other forms of racial oppression like slavery, Jim Crow, and convict leasing. Brian Stevenson, pictured here, a modern civil rights leader and inspiration behind the blockbuster film Just Mercy, claims that slavery doesn't end, it just evolves. Stevenson has personally overturned 135 wrongful convictions, freeing scores of innocent poor and people of color from the clutches of death row. Given his accomplishment, his claim of slavery not ending cannot be taken lightly, let alone dismissed out of hand. While I agree with the sentiment and tone of the righteous anger explicit in his statement, in many ways, this type of thinking denies the victorious social movements of Black folks against past systems of racial oppression like slavery and Jim Crow. Victories that can be used as examples of high levels of coordination, of collective action, and the fortitude needed to muster the perseverance to end the carceral state in all its forms. As a community and political organizer for then Illinois State Senator Barack Obama on the south side of Chicago, I also held the view that prison building was a corrupt political process rife with blood money from privatization. However, as I relocated my family to rural Arkansas to uncover why rural communities were increasingly demanding prisons, I would be disavowed of this notion. This view of prison building is rooted in urban northern bias, rendering rural places powerless, especially communities of color. I came to learn this soon after meeting folks like the late, great Coach Cecil Twilley, pictured here. A proud man with a glimmer in his eye, as if he knew something that you didn't, and he was itching to tell you, but only if you asked him very nicely. Coach was a pioneer in Forest City in the Mississippi Delta. He integrated the school board. He was the first Black coach at the local of the high school. He was the first Black member of the country club. He did all of this nearly 50 years ago. This is why he was still known as Coach in a predominantly Black town of nearly 15,000. Forest City is also home to about 1,900 prisoners located in the Forest City Federal Correctional Facility, constructed in 1997. Contrary to popular belief, my empirical analysis in the paper listed here shows that towns with high poverty, but also Black and Latinx populations are more likely to build prisons. As an early supporter of the prison, Coach elucidates why he welcomed a hideously stigmatized institution like a prison when he explained, I don't want my town to end up like Gary. That's a marquee for the Jackson 5 and a picture of Gary in the 1990s. Now, for those of you who aren't quite as young as me, or I'll just say chronologically challenged, right? The Jackson 5 broke up a little bit before the 1990s. So Gary is not looking good in the 1990s. This is downtown Forest City in the around 2007. And this is around the time I visited there. So racial stigma from uneven and underdevelopment is why a lot of folks, Black and white, reported or told me they supported prison building in town. Coach's quip also offers a counterintuitive insight about why rural communities that used to respond, not in my backyard, to prisons now say, please in my backyard, or PIMBY. Site fights or debates over community opposition in supportive facilities with harmful environmental effects have been documented by scholars like Robert Buller, who advocate for policies to reverse climate change. As I argue in my first book, Big House on the Prairie, covering stigma from the rise of the rural ghetto was essential to a reputation management strategy driving the campaign to win the placement of the prison. Coach's response demonstrates the agency of Black leaders operating between the little man and the man, and partnering with white elites to secure development that folks may not have, that some of the locals, poor local folks may not necessarily have wanted. But because Black middlemen had agency and power, they could leverage that in getting to prison. So I'm going to turn towards a paper that I'm in the middle of wrapping up, but with 10 moves or 11 moves in 13 years, I've been dragging a little bit with this paper. And this paper is about the political economy of prison building. It's with my colleagues at Texas A&M listed here. So just to give you a background, a little bit of context, I've been talking about the national trends in prison building. I want to give you just a rural segment of this. This is prison building prior to 1970 for rural communities only. This is what it looks like since 1970 in rural communities. So there's been this huge influx of prisons across the US, most of them in the rural South. So for this question, for this paper, I had two research questions that of course came out too quickly. What are the state level predictors of prison building over the course of the prison boom? And also what are the local predictors of prison building during the prison boom? So what are the predictors at the town level that correspond with prison building? And if you guys want to get into this, I can show you this in the Q&A, but I'd rather just push forward and talk about the conceptual model I'm working with and describing prison building. I'm going to show you the results of this paper in a second, but prison building or constructing a prison is within the municipality. Prison closing is closing it. This is something I've thought a lot about since last being in person with my panelist, Ashley Rubin, so I could demonstrate like what prison siting is versus prison placement. Prison siting is from the state or federal level, the forces that are pushing a prison into a place. Prison placement is about the local factors pulling the prison in. So for this paper, Punishment is Purple, what we find is quite counterintuitively that across the prison boom, state level predictors of prison building include democratic strength in a state legislative body, I'm sorry. So if the governor and both the House and Senate of a state are democratic, that predicts prison building. I can show all of this afterwards as well, but I don't know if you remember this when I get through running through all of the recent results I have. The Gini coefficient or income inequality predicts prison building, and surplus land also predicts prison building. So state level predictors of prison building across the prison boom do not consistently include factors like surplus labor. So the unemployment rate in the state really isn't a strong predictor of whether or not that state will get a prison. Neither is the gross state product. Local factors are consistent with my prior work in this area. The disadvantage score, or what I'm calling the rural ghetto, is a predictor of prison building. Percent Black, the size, so towns that are less than 50,000, but greater than 10,000 are more likely to get a prison and a prior prison being built there. This is I'm going to show you a couple of as I think I have 3 minutes left. So I'm gonna, of course, in the last 3 minutes, just dump a whole bunch of information on you. This is partisan voting at the county level. And this shows the Democratic margin of victory. And this is in rural communities only, non-metropolitan counties. This is their partisan voting. Basically, what you're looking at is the probability of getting a prison in a county increases if 4 years prior to the opening of the prison, the Democratic margin of victory was greater. That's one little interesting tidbit that we're working through. This is another paper on partisanship and prison building. Here's another paper that shows something that really is kind of common sense. When you show this to smart alecky college kids, if anyone has any of those people living in their home, I have one in my home. I showed this to my son, and he said, nobody's demonstrated this, not to my knowledge. This shows state level, state prison building is a predictor of incarceration, right? So the number of prisons built and what happens with the incarceration rate, as you see with a 10-year lag, 10 years after prisons are open, the incarceration rate is going up. But we also did this for 5, 3, and even concurrently. This is all very important because right now we just had a BJS report come out last month showing that prisoners are at the same level, the incarceration rate, I should say, is at the same level in 2019 as it was in 1995. So we're seeing a decrease, we're seeing decarceration take place. And under COVID, that's actually happened even more so. I would argue that part of why we haven't seen, part of why incarceration isn't continuing to go up is because in 1995, that was the peak of the prison building boom, as demonstrated here, right? So since then, we just haven't been building prisons at the same rate. So that makes sense that our incarceration rate would be going down. Lastly, I want to show you guys this. We built our way into this mess. I'm doing a project on COVID and confined spaces. And this is a map of all US prisons and the counties the county COVID rate per 100,000. And we know that prisons, jails, and immigrant detention centers are all hotspots for COVID. But this could have been avoided if we didn't build so many prisons. We built our way into this mess. So I look forward to hearing your questions and comments and engaging with the other panelists as well. Thank you.
John, thanks so much for that. There was a bunch in there that I will be sort of referencing constantly. So thank you. I'm going to turn to Ashley Rubin, who's going to speak to us. Are you good, Ashley? You've got the technology?
I'm good, thank you, I think.
Okay.
So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And there's my talk. Okay, so I think you guys can see that, I hope. Okay, so my talk, or first of all, thank you so much to Sandra and Jeff for organizing this fantastic conference, to the grad students working so hard behind the scenes, Kevin for organizing or chairing this panel and stepping in at the last minute. Sorry, all my caffeine just kicked in all at once as my nerves start going. So my talk is going to be a little bit different from most of the talks in this wonderful 3-day conference, and that I'm less interested directly in what's going on in prisons and punishment, but I'm more interested in what's happening in the trends in the literature about prisons and punishment. So let me progress my slide. There we go. Okay, so the story starts with what I call kind of the lore of punishment in society. So around 2000, 2001, 2002, a number of scholars, including my co-panelist, Jonathan Simon, noted that there is a growing shift in the literature on prisons. The shift has taken a number of different turns or a number of different descriptions, but basically this decline of in-prison research, qualitative research conducted within prisons, ethnographic research conducted within prisons. And one of the things that's so striking about this, well, three of the things I should say are so striking about this. First of all, is it's in contrast to this kind of previous golden era of prison sociology going back to the 1940s and 50s. But like kind of by the 80s and especially the 90s, it seemed like we weren't really doing this rich ethnographic research anymore. It's also striking because it's right at the moment where there are so many prisons, as John has just demonstrated, and there are so many people behind bars. Mass incarceration is literally defined as a concept around this time, and yet we're not really studying what's going on inside the prisons. And then I should also say that it's increasingly in contrast to prison sociology in Europe and Latin America, especially in recent years, but even going back there. So there's this really interesting, basically decline of this type of research. And the discussions of this decline have continued in more recent literature reviews of this subfield. And a lot of these recent discussions have been focusing on not just kind of describing the change, but also trying to explain why it might be that we see less of this research. And one of the dominant explanations is that we as scholars have basically lost access to US prisons and other carceral facilities. And I should say throughout, I'm kind of merging, it's a little sloppy, but I'm merging prisons, jails, kind of criminal mental institutions, basically any place of carceral control within the criminal justice system. And so going back to these explanations, people have pointed to a number of factors that prevent scholars from being able to access prisons and other carceral facilities. So first and foremost is that prison gatekeepers are refusing entry. This is something that I can personally attest to, that I have had this experience, and I know a number of other people have. And if it's not, just you can't get access, it's also the other issues that it takes so long to get access, even if you can get access. So that has a big chilling effect. Another reason that people have pointed out is the sheer distance between most universities and prisons. As John has showed us, a lot of them are built in rural areas very far from the cities that a lot of research universities are located in. And so that's another contributing factor that people have offered. And finally, the growing bureaucracy of research ethics and the kind of growing power of IRBs that are putting constraints on research, especially in prisons, for really important reasons. There's a huge history of problematic research conducted within prisons, especially medical, but not just limited to that. So university IRBs are also kind of having this chilling effect of people's access to prisons. But other reasons that people have offered include, including in some of the original articles that I just discussed, is that it's not actually the decline of all prison research, but it's the decline of ethnographic research within prisons, or full-on ethnographies within prisons. So people like Karamet Ryder have pointed out that medical and psychological research has continued. Basically unabated. So it's that there's certain types of researchers, certain types of research, especially basic as opposed to applied, qualitative as opposed to quantitative, and so on. So it's certain types of research and researchers that are being locked out rather than all researchers together. Another explanation people have offered is that secondary data analysis has become so much easier in recent decades, especially quantitative analysis. So at this point, we can all just basically download the census of US prisons and jails and do a bunch of interesting research without ever stepping foot in prisons, especially as qualitative repositories are increasingly taking off. We can also download people's data sets that have been posted there. At least those that are able to do so following ethics review. And then finally, another possibility to explain this decline of this type of research is that increasingly people are interested in other types of prison-related topics. So around 2003, re-entry becomes a really interesting topic that people start to study with the publication of Joan Peter-Cilia's book. Increasingly, people are focused on macro-level analyses trying to explain mass incarceration. I would say at this point, the dominant motif of punishment society literature is mostly kind of trying to explain penal change as opposed to kind of going inside carceral facilities. Additionally, also around 2003, I believe, the collateral consequences literature looking at the consequences of incarceration on children, on families, on the female partners of incarcerated people, on neighborhoods. This literature starts to take off with the publication of a book on collateral consequences, and then there are a number of books published in 2007, 2008. So basically, there are all these topics that people can now study about prisons without ever stepping foot in prisons if they so desire. So all of these things could be pulling away our attention and our energies from studying what's going on inside prisons, at least from a firsthand perspective. Okay, so then the problem with all this is it's not super clear that the reality actually fits this lore. So this is just a number of relatively high profile studies of people who have gone inside prisons and collected especially qualitative data or used qualitative methods, and especially ethnographic methods to study what's going on inside prisons. And if you've ever written that line kind of talking about citing Simon, Rhodes, and Waquant, saying, there's this dearth of qualitative ethnographic research conducted within prisons, that kind of see, Goodman 2008 or whatever, that list of exceptions is growing. At this point, there are dozens of studies, there are almost more studies published since 2000 than were published before 2000. So it's not really clear that the reality actually fits this, this original description. In fact, some people have referred to Waquant's Curious Eclipse of Prison Ethnography article as a now dated article. So what I wanted to do with this study is to try to analyze basically systematically what's going on with prison research. So I have two research questions in this project. And the first one is, have we really been locked out? That is some sort of lockout contributing to a decline of in-prison research? Now, I want to just make clear that in this research question, I'm doing a bit of a bait and switch. Previously, I was talking about ethnographic, qualitative research, as well as in-prison research. In this case, I'm broadening out to all in-prison research. So whether it's qualitative or quantitative, ethnographic or not, I'm really interested in, have researchers been locked out? So some of the reasons why we might think this, in addition to what I've gone over, or some ways that we might see this decline taking place, is increasingly people have turned to a number of creative methods to try to study what's going on within prisons, including, to use a term from Hemmons and Marquardt, is to look to ex-mates, or more appropriately, formerly incarcerated people, to learn about the prison experience. Going to other countries' prisons to study those prisons, because we can't get access to US prisons, using more secondary data, and then finally turning to these other topics. So that's the first research question. And the second one is, if there's not actually a decline, as it really seems to be the case just based on kind of paying attention to the literature, what's driving that perception of the decline? So is it the case that it's really an eclipse of carceral ethnography, as was originally discussed, but is not always being kind of described as such, but rather, so it's an eclipse of carceral ethnography rather than all in-prison research. So is it the case that it really is different methods that are being able to take place within prisons and others that are not being able to take place? Is it the case that people from different disciplines are getting access, again, like medical and psychological, as opposed to, say, sociology or criminology? Is it also the case, perhaps, that it depends on what state you're in, what prison or prison system you approach? There are certain states that seem to be far more open to scholarly access than others, some that have really good reputations for being very cooperative at this point. And then finally, there's also the possibility that there are certain researchers at certain universities or certain departments that have very strong relationships with their state's departments of corrections that are able to get that access. So they might be kind of powerhouses of research, whereas other places that are less well connected have not been able to do that same research. So for this paper, this presentation, I'm just going to focus on the first question, this question of lockout. I have a second paper that I'm still doing the data analysis for to look at the second research question, but I wanted to basically fully vet this first one before moving on to the second project. Okay, so how did I do this? I'm using dissertation abstracts from US PhD students published in English. I'm happy to talk more in the Q&A about why PhD dissertations are a useful data source. In some cases, they're kind of the best case scenario for looking at the research. They're also a really helpful, clear, kind of clean data set, whereas like books and articles, it becomes a lot more complicated. I'm also looking at 1980 to 2019. 1980 is the first year where I could actually get systematic data. Before that, it's very hit and miss, and there's a lot of selection bias. I've downloaded these nearly 1900 dissertation abstracts from the ProQuest Dissertations and Theses global database, which contains about 97% of all US dissertations. And that's been pretty constant, even though there are some schools that have recently gotten rid of the requirement that you have to upload your dissertation. I used a series of search terms trying to get at any study that mentions a type of carceral facility using a variety of different words, as well as a number of different methods that I associate with qualitative research, but that don't have to be only qualitative research. So one thing about the methods addition is, if I didn't add these in, I would have way more data than I would be able to manage. So there are kind of multiple reasons for doing that. I'll also say I did think of other research or other search terms after the fact. And unfortunately, fortunately, when I redid the search, it was only like 30 more dissertations that would come back. So that was good. So I'm pretty confident with the search terms, even though they're definitely imperfect. I then analyzed these abstracts with an undergraduate RA doing a qualitative content analysis. We randomized the abstracts, blinded all information except for the title and the abstract, and did our coding independently and did a number of cross checks and recoding and subcoding and things like that. In terms of what we're coding for, so for this first project, it's actually pretty simple. We just coded the abstracts into 7 different categories. The first one being the one that I'm most interested in, which is this in-prison research category. And again, this is only looking at research conducted within prisons, within US prisons. And even though, again, I'm using this term prison, I really mean any carceral facility within the US. But I also coded, or we also coded for non-US carceral facilities, as well as studies that were using secondary data. So they, never stepped foot within a carceral facility. I should mention that it wasn't always clear, it wasn't always explicitly made in the abstract whether or not this was actually secondary data or not. A lot of the abstracts were kind of unclear. So I distinguished in the original coding between stated and suspected secondary data analysis, and then recoded the suspected ones just to be sure. We also coded for abstracts that were dissertations based on interviews with or other types of data analysis of formerly incarcerated people, as well as studies of the families and neighbors of incarcerated people, other criminal justice topics, which is a kind of a catch-all topic or a catch-all category, and then finally false positives for all those studies of people studying prisoners' dilemmas that have nothing to do with incarcerated people, although there was one study actually testing the prisoner's dilemma on incarcerated people. So I'm referring to these middle categories as what I call prison adjacent research. So it's about the prison, it touches on the prison, but it's not, the people who are doing these studies are not actually going inside prisons. Okay, so in terms of what I'm looking for in this data, now that it's coded, is whether or not we see in-prison research decline over time in absolute numbers as a share of all dissertations, whether that's all social science dissertations or all dissertations combined, including STEM, for example, and then also relative to other prison-related dissertations. So basically just looking at the data set itself. So I'm gonna go through each of these in turn. And I realized I did not actually set my timer. So I think I'm gonna be on time, but we'll see. Okay, so starting with the decline in absolute numbers. So here are the data in all their glory. And what I think is most striking about this is that in-prison research has increased over time, which is unexpected given the early literature, but kind of consistent with what we're just kind of experiencing by opening up a journal. So we see that it's going up over time. These are histograms. Each one is binned into 5-year periods, so it's 1980 to 1984 and so on. And they're all on the same axis, so you can kind of see the relative amounts. All of the categories go up over time with a slight exception of the families and neighborhoods category, as well as the international prisons. But basically, if you compare like before 2000, for example, all of them are bigger over time, which to some extent is what you'd expect because we're looking at absolute numbers. There are way more graduate students these days, way more criminology programs that tend to be interested in prisons and punishment and so on. Okay. So moving on then to the question of as a share of all social science and all dissertations overall. So since there are more grad students these days and more social science grad students and all that, maybe the relative share of dissertations, maybe that's changing. But it turns out that all of these categories are also increasing over time. So this is a bit of a complicated graph, and I just want to take a moment to explain the axes. So on the left axis over here, this is only for in-prison research, which is this line, which is going up quite substantially. And so this is a percent of all social science dissertations based on NSF figures. So we start at about a little bit more than 0.25% of all social science dissertations and going up to about 0.38% of all social science dissertations. For all the other categories, because they're such a smaller amount, they're on this axis. And so like you can see, for example, for secondary data, this line, we start at just a little bit more than 0%, and we end at about 0.07% of all social science dissertations. So even when we take into account the increase of dissertations over time, we're still seeing this increase of all of these topics, including this dramatic growth over time of in-prison research or dissertations based on in-prison research. And then finally, what's the trend relative to these other dissertations in my data set? So again, excluding the false positives, so any dissertation that mentions prison or other types of carceral facilities and uses one of these types of methods that I mentioned, or at least discusses one of these methods. Okay, so here's where the story really gets interesting. There is a pretty substantial decline, and it gets a lot bigger midway through. So again, using the same kind of double axes. So again, the left side is the in-prison research. So we start in the early 80s with nearly 80% of these prison-related dissertations conducting in-prison research, at least as a component of that dissertation. And it comes down to just over 40% by the late 2010s. And this is in contrast to all of the other categories that we're looking at, most notably this other criminal justice topic. So people studying, for example, the school to prison pipeline would be in this category if they're not actually going within a carceral facility and they're more interested in kind of studying schools and people getting then sent to prison without following them there. Likewise, studies of formerly incarcerated people has also increased quite dramatically over time. So starting at about just under or just around 5% and ending just over 20% of this data set. There's some other interesting findings here, which is like the family and neighbors studies. They peak roughly when you would expect. So right around 2005 to 2010 or 2009, excuse me, which is when we see a whole bunch of studies coming out on collateral consequences. And then it doesn't quite keep pace. It's still higher than it was in the early days, but that peak is kind of shortly lived. One that is not as high as I would have expected is the secondary data analysis that remains, it grows, but it remains fairly small and limited. One reason for this, just to be clear, is that it's secondary data analysis, which includes both qualitative and quantitative data. And the other thing is it's not every single dissertation that uses secondary data analysis. So if you're in a different topic than that I've listed, then you would go there instead of here. I forgot to mention earlier, obviously these categories are not mutually exclusive. So I used a flow chart to make them mutually exclusive for coding purposes because I wanted to see these as distinct trends. Okay, so those are the big findings. So in terms of wrapping up, it's really hard to say in light of this research that scholars are being locked out of prisons and other types of carceral facilities. But there's still the possibility that there are certain methods, topics, types of research questions, disciplines, and so on that have actually been locked out while others have not been. And so the second paper in the series is going to look at those sorts of changes to try to see if it really is something more like a curious eclipse of ethnography as opposed to just scholarly research taking place within prisons. That said, it really does seem like in-prison research is less popular relative to other topics. It's not keeping pace with the overall popularity of prison-based research. One final note is that the timing is really interesting. So again, this decline really takes off starting in the early 2000s. So again, these are 5-year bins. So right around 2000 to 2005, we start to see this big decline. So the decline is starting, but it really becomes significant in this period. So that's really interesting because that's right after these articles come out in 2000, 2001, and 2002, saying that it's really hard to get access to prison. And then, and even if they don't say that exactly, that's definitely how people have been talking about them. So it's entirely possible that would-be dissertation writers are thinking like, well, I don't want to waste my time trying to get access to something I won't be able to get access to. Or alternatively, their advisors are telling them, don't waste your time, study prisons from a different method, download this data set or whatever. So that's one possibility. The other that I think is also a pretty good possibility is that more people are interested in mass incarceration or other types of topics. So in 2001, there's a special issue on mass incarceration and punishment society. David Garland defines the term mass imprisonment, and it's become kind of our standard definition. It's not that people weren't talking about mass incarceration before, but the field really takes off in this period. And so I think it's possible that more people are coming to grad school specifically to study this topic rather than the kind of old school prison sociology of wanting to see what's taking place inside prisons. So I'll go ahead and stop it there. Thank you so much for your time. And to the organizers.
Excellent. Thanks, Ashley. I have my own questions, but I think we've just noticed a few questions appearing from the crowd. So thanks to everyone. So we'll turn to Jonathan Simon. And
before you disappear, can you hear me?
You're there.
If you can hear, I'm there. Hey, everybody. So first of all, thank you for including me in this extraordinary 3-day celebration, really, of the opening of this incredibly important research center. The program itself makes clear the urgency and demand for this kind of research and interest in it. And I'm so excited that the University of Alberta has made this step to be such a platform as it is literally in this moment. I also am grateful to all of you, to whoever's left. We can't see the number of actual participants here, but let me just say these are times that, as the folk song says, try people's souls. And that, I mean, put the soul on trial. And I think it's a medieval kind of trial, not a modern trial. But there are also times where, as Gershom Scholem once said, there are plastic moments where institutions that seem permanent and unchangeable suddenly start to wobble and look changeable. And so in the spirit of that plastic moment, let me talk about abolition. And hopefully it's not the first time it's come up during this conference. I haven't been able to attend everything. But I want to think about abolition through a curious lens, the geographic and temporal relationship between Norway and California. And I won't spend any time treating those as penal states or, for comparative purposes. So let me begin with an imaginary scene that I didn't witness, but I've heard about, roughly speaking, in the world before pandemic, the pre-time as we call it now. It's a scene at the San Francisco International Airport. There's a group of men and women of various races, and they're all employees of the California Department of Corrections in high managerial positions. They run essentially as bureaucrats one of the world's largest and today most disgraced prison systems that has been found, quote, uncivilized or not fit for a civilized society by the US Supreme Court, which remains horribly overcrowded, responsible for lots of deaths and suicides, etc. What were these CDCR people doing? They were actually meeting with a group of academics from places like UCSF, including my friend and colleague and one of my heroes, Dr. Bree Williams, who's a real fighter for the lives and human rights of people imprisoned, and in this project was taking California penal bureaucrats to Norway to see what many in the world consider to be the most human dignity respecting prisons in the world, to, in a sense, shake up their worldview. Now, I want to make two observations about this, and I'll come back to whether Norway is a realistic model for how California prisons could be reformed. But there are two things that are interesting to me about this scene. One is that if we leap back into the late 60s, or even the 60s, and the scene behind me is 1968, in some ways, the positions are switched, or at least we can certainly say that nobody would have gotten on a plane in California to visit prisons in Norway to learn from them. Instead, Norway had pretty brutal and inhumane prisons, most of them very, very old. They had a pretty large prison population, some of it not even convicted of crimes. All kinds of special measures were in vogue and still in the post-war period. While California, at least on the surface, boasted of a suite of new modern rehabilitative penology prisons built in the 50s and more in the 60s, notwithstanding having a huge capacity of old-fashioned brutal prisons, but that wasn't the surface of California. So that's one observation. The other observation, in addition to that, is that it so happens that these two places, Norway and California, in roughly the period of the 1960s and 70s, were, I'm going to assert, and you've just heard how good I am at intuiting big empirical phenomena out there, but I think I have, at least from my reading of the history and some of the historians and the literature, if you can imagine a geographic Google Ngram of prison abolition discourse, not only would you find a big surge in the 60s and 70s that then goes way down, at least in North America, but you would also find geographic hotspots in California and Norway, especially Northern California. So very quickly, I want to talk about three things. Why did these places so different and become facilitators of abolition discourse? Secondly, what explains such different outcomes? And finally, what can we in the United States, where there is a renaissance of abolition discourse, learn from Norway or from the relationship between Norway and California? So why did this happen in the places it did? And actually here I'm relying heavily on Thomas Madison, the great sociologist of law and punishment, who wrote a very important, famous book, maybe the most famous, at least in Europe, about abolition, the politics of abolition, but also has a wonderful autobiography called Cadenza, a professional autobiography in which he talks a lot about the broader Scandinavian abolition movement, the Norwegian movement, his role in it, the politics of it. And asking this very question that I've been like, why now, why there, or why then, why there? He points to three things, three factors. One, he says angry people. You need a preponderance of sort of angry people, but he clearly means what he calls moral indignation, people who feel moral indignation. And I love the term indignation because not all anger is the same. Anger that comes from a sense that human dignity is being violated. Righteous play takes the form sometimes of, say, property damage. But in any event, you need a lot of morally indignant people. The second factor, he said, 1968. You need something that, as to use the framework he uses from the great sociologist William I. Thomas, changes the definition of the situation, makes what was simply not imaginable suddenly imaginable. And for his generation and that wave of abolition, it was the year 1968, right? Which is the year you see behind me, at least in Chicago, where I remember it. And finally, you need prison knowledge from prisoners and prison people, formerly imprisoned people, activists, lawyers, criminologists. And this becomes, he thinks, the kind of seed base for an abolition movement. So, just very briefly, think about those places in terms of those things. Lots of people who are morally indignant. I didn't know that Norway had a lot of such people at the time, but they were there. And it turned out it was largely because they were working in the infrastructure of the correctional system and the welfare system. And they saw this glaring gap between the way people were treated in this glowing socialist welfare system and the way people were treated in these brutal prisons. So they became morally indignant. In California, it is, here we have to recognize the big gulf between the two places. It's really moral indignation about racism and the anti-Black quality of policing, of prisons, fueled as well by the Vietnam War, which by the time this period is really beginning to focus on prisons, is really become a big subject of moral indignation. Second, 1968, important punctuation point, maybe the biggest one until right now, at least I feel that in some ways. I can't speak to Norway, maybe some of the people on this call can. May 68, which we think of as Paris, was a broader European event. Some of these Scandinavian activists went to Paris, participated in these events. There may have been similar moments in Scandinavia itself. 68 in California, are you kidding? Berkeley and the Bay Area are one of the global images of, revolution and change of circumstances, change of the situation. And for the prison world, this is heavily focused in the Bay Area around solidarity with especially Black and brown prisoners in the California prison system who are describing their imprisonment as a form of slavery and talking about a violent revolution to end it. Pretty different. It seems to me May 68 ends on a somewhat happy note for the left, even though they don't actually take power anywhere, but they feel good about what happened. In the United States, if you've been watching the trial of the Chicago 7, it's punishment time and especially murder time for many activists of color like Fred Hampton in Chicago, where I live. Finally, you have to have prison knowledge. And it's interesting that in both places, you get an interesting mix of academics, social workers, lawyers, and prisoners. That's roughly the order I think that they held in importance in Norway, at least initially. Prisoners, I think, eventually became more important. In California, I think the prisoner movement was really the driving focus of abolition. And academics, lawyers, and activists activists would have been higher up, but academics were even below lawyers, I think, in their influence. So very quickly, why such different outcomes? Well, I think the most important factor is the relationship to the state, that is between the abolitionist movement around prisons and the state. In Norway, you've got a robust welfare state that's building itself out and is being called to account by activists who are saying essentially that prisoners are potential welfare clients who are being ignored and indeed abused by the way they're being treated. In California, you have at the beginning of the 60s a growth in the welfare state. It's a liberal version of it. However, its anti-Blackness is there from the very beginning. And by the end of the 60s, after Ronald Reagan becomes governor in California, the whole New Deal sort of liberal attempt to construct a welfare state in California goes into radical reverse, although it'll take a while to play itself out. And punishment obviously is one of the spaces in which that reversal takes place. A second factor that I'm really interested now in, especially when you recognize that abolition in the United States was driven by Black politics, radical Black politics, Black activism, as it is now, is the changes in the global patterns of what we could call decolonization politics, because I think many, certainly Black activists in the 70s saw themselves as decolonization activists, and there is always a global aspect to these phenomena. Then in the 60s and 70s, that was a very lively space in which many prison activists imagined themselves, dominated by revolution and national liberation fronts, nationalism, broadly speaking, and revolutionary Marxism. Today, I won't even try to characterize it, but it's much more complex, I would say, dominated by a kind of intersectional, human dignity infused version of the Black radical tradition, but also disability rights, trans and LGBTQ, queer politics. So it's it's a broader, I think, field than it was, at least in the US in the 70s now. And then the third factor that I think is interesting is the relationship to academia. All right, there are academics in both groups. In Norway, I think academics who wrote on prisons and punishment, people like Thomas, people like Nils Christie, were some of the most respected public intellectuals. People debated them, journalists debated them. They weren't always agreed with, but they were always respected. They were listened to, they were important. They helped to essentially be a bridge for prisoners and former prisoners to put their voices and their demands in front of the nation and debate it. In the US, there was a moment where that might have happened, but think about what happened to the Berkeley School of Criminology, which was a space that Thomas Madison writes about visiting at this time and was in dialogue with Black-led political abolitionism. How did the political and academic field respond to that? They eliminated the school, the first school in the history of the University of California system, as Johan Kohler's great article in Criminology expounds on. Eliminated both because it was too radical and too in touch with too much of a bridge to the carceral state itself in some ways. So finally, and I'm going to try to wrap up here, because I'd love to have more of a discussion around these great papers and especially all the data shared by my colleagues. Not too much data here. You know, what can we who in the United States now, I think, have the opportunity to be part of an abolition movement? And by the way, you know, people, I talk a lot now when I get a chance to about things like defund the police, abolish prisons and police. And, you know, I'm always told by journalists and others, well, you know, it's a tiny minority that supports that, even in communities of color. But the point is, like 5 years ago, that wasn't even a discussion, wasn't even an option on the table. The very fact that it's in the space as it was in Norway and in California in the 70s is what's important. So what can we learn now that it really never died in California? It's one of the reasons I want to study it, because it never went away completely. It was a tide pool. And then with the critical resistance movement kind of came back in the 1990s. One is that it's a long-term project, but we knew that. Madison talked about it in the Politics of Abolition as the politics of the unfinished, that we're always sort of heading toward a horizon. And that's clear that if today Norway is a place worth visiting to think about what prisons should look like, it may be because they had a vigorous abolition movement that was taken seriously and put the penal bureaucrats in a defensive posture to do everything they could to show that human dignity was in fact compatible with imprisonment. Now, I think personally, it's not reasonable to believe that we could become Norway in terms of prisons, but that is we, California. Just think that the average prison size in Norway is under 500 or under 500, I believe. There is no prison in California that has fewer than 2,500 prisoners in it. But if there is something to learn from Norway, it may be about what abolition can do to change the prison system. The second thing I think we can learn from Norway, and it actually makes some sense of what we're hearing from the defund the police movement today, is that it takes a welfare state. You know, if you really want to shrink the carceral state, you need to recover a robust possibility for a welfare state. It's interesting that defund the police has put that focus on whether we can move the resources and bring new resources into solving the problems, unmet need, grotesque unmet need of the same communities that are over-policed and over-incarcerated. So we definitely need a recovery of the welfare state. We can't look to it to a Biden administration, I don't think, at the moment, unless the Senate shifts to fund that, but we can take some steps. Finally, and here I want to be provocative, I think there's no alternative, broadly speaking, to, and I'm going to put this in quotes, a liberal political framework in which human rights and human dignity are at the forefront. I think if you look at the Black Lives Matter movement today and compare it to the Black Power movement of the 1960s or 70s, it is very different. I wouldn't say it's liberal, that is, I'll give them the right to call liberals whatever names they want, but it is liberal in the broad sense that it recognizes human dignity as a core value. If we end up embracing illiberal paths out of this, it's more likely to look, I fear, like Poland or Hungary than it is like the kind of place that many of us, Canada, would like to live. Let me stop there and hope that we can have a discussion about what's ahead.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Those are sort of interesting and well-integrated panels. I love how Ashley's sort of invoking Jonathan from a few years ago. I have several questions. Everyone can hear me? Just a quick nod of your head. Yeah, okay, great. So thank you very much. So I have a question from Marta to John. John, thanks for your presentation. I'm curious whether you have a sense or data on why Democrat governments increase the likelihood of prison building. It seems highly counterintuitive.
It is highly counterintuitive. The issue here is that we talk about mass incarceration as one thing, or we talk about a criminal justice system as one thing, and there's all of these parts. So my second slide, I started to break out just what mass incarceration is, but even the prison boom or prison proliferation, there's periods around this, and geography matters. That's why I moved to the rural South to study Forest City, Arkansas. So what people don't realize is, I love, there's always been movement politics in California around prison building. You see that to a different degree all across the country, but in the South, California isn't even a top 5 prison builder, right? They didn't even reach number 5. Oklahoma built more prisons than California. And so most prisons are built in the South, in rural communities. And so if you think about the period where that graph I showed, where the boom was taking place late 80s, and then it peaked around 95, those are in southern states, Florida, Georgia, Texas. Those are all Democratic governors, Democratic legislatures that are today all Republican. These are Dixiecrats. They just changed parties. They have about the same politics. And it's the political economy of place, not just locally, but at the state level, is based in race and racism. It's steeped in the history of white supremacy and maintaining that order. So that's partly why I push back against the way we talk and think about abolitionist frameworks, because there are 450,000 corrections officers, and actually African Americans are overrepresented in that group. So yeah, I'll just say that this is a mess. Everything we did, it's not one thing.
Right.
I have one concept, but this is a mess that cuts across multiple units of analysis and changes over time.
Right. I mean, it sounds like classical sociological overdetermination. Yeah. So Ashley, I'm going to use my prerogative of chair, and given that I'm a methods junkie, I have a question for you. It's great to sort of see you interrogate these pieces that we all kind of reference all the time. I was just wondering, but in terms of the question of, I get the point about sort of there's been a numerical increase, But if you're going to get at the question of whether people have been locked out, don't you have to get at like how many applications were submitted and declined, how many ethics applications were submitted and declined, and even the more problematic methodological question, how many people thought about doing prison research and just said, there's no way I can do that? I think that's the larger locked out question.
Yeah, so the real answer, thank you for the question. The real answer is this paper was not my primary, this is a spin-off project of the one, this is basically, I started the coding project to clean my data set and then realized that I had a bunch of data in practice. So yeah, so studying the lockout issue is really tricky. There are so many different ways that you could go about the question. I think actually doing it would be like really thorny. And as you said, I mean, there's so many different levels of what shapes people's decisions. So what I was really interested in was looking at the trends in the literature. And I actually went back and forth on my slide, really like it's a chicken and an egg thing. Is it, for the lockout question, is it, now I'm forgetting the terminology that I used, but it was basically like the lockout question, does that come first or does the other one come, like, has there been a decline in the research? So the real question that I have is whether or not there's been a decline in the research that I'm framing as a lockout issue. So yeah, definitely, like if I wanted to look at like a survey of, have you ever tried to access a prison? How seriously did you try? What was the reason why you, didn't get access? Was it a gatekeeper? Was it IRB? Was it your advisor? And that sort of thing. But I was more interested in like the output level. Do we actually see this decline? And what I'm really interested in is the paper 2 stuff, to be honest, is what type of, what's actually the kind of methodological change.
Yeah, great, thank you. So I have a question here from Nicholas to Jonathan Simon. Is affirming the need of a welfare state a way to delegitimize anarchic understandings of abolitionism? Does this mean that abolitionism is, in your eyes, limited to reformism?
Well, thank you for the question, Nicholas. I think my short answer is no and no. No, because I mean, I've said it's an arc of unfinished. I mean, when I say welfare state, what I essentially mean is a state with the authority to tax rich people and redistribute some of that money to relieve the poor. Now, that it doesn't need to take the form of a vast social work apparatus that has a bad history of being anti-Black itself and eugenics and things like that. It might just take the form of a check, or now I guess just shows up in your bank account. So I don't know enough about what the possibilities are there. What I do know is that if anarchism means the poor are on their own, which is I think what it means for the Heritage Foundation and folks like that, I don't think that's what it means for the Black Lives Matter movement, but I won't, they don't need academics to tell them, at least certainly not a white male academic like myself, to tell them what it means. What form should it take, I think, is a really important question of caretaking. What I think is, what I'm hearing from at least some of the abolition discourse that I'm able to filter, it is talking about care, sort of, taking care of people, broadly speaking, addressing needs. Should that take the form, Berkeley right now is under pressure to shrink its police force, and so these would be active local questions. Do you think it's a good idea we, have a mental health agency that goes out and tries to intervene in mental health crises that aren't the police, or a social work agency that would try to intervene in domestic violence situations? Or is that just the state reshaping its form of policing? I mean, I'll leave that to your generation to sort out, because I think we'll be cutting through some version of that, even in the best of most optimistic scenario I can think of.
Right.
Thanks.
Thanks, Jonathan. Moving back up to the top, a question for John, and this one is for Ashley. I'll read it. Thank you for sharing your compelling talk, John. I was wondering if under current neoliberal conditions and pulling from the environmental justice and environmental racism literature, is it possible that another contributing factor is a shift from industrial and environmentally polluting institutions and complex sightings in low SES and BIPOC communities to more lucrative sightings, such as private prisons, where the harmful consequences are more easily hidden?
We don't have enough private prisons for that to matter. Only 13% of all prisons are private. That's part of, so that's a good question, but that's something I'm looking to investigate in terms of looking at some forms of locally undesirable land uses and seeing if they're being swapped out. But your towns that are in the market for one locally undesirable land use, typically they cluster those types of land uses, given that once you're down it's almost like you're down a path of uneven or underdevelopment, and it's hard to diversify your market for lemons if you consider all of these really bad, either toxic, polluting facilities. And I had people, and I had a number of respondents talk about that they actually had enough social capital, in my case in Forest City, where they didn't want to get they framed getting to prison as a better way of development and reputation management than say getting a toxic waste facility, right? So they had enough, that's why you can't be too Black or too poor, right? You have to have enough diversity because you won't have enough social capital to get a high level of, the market for lemons is, if we're using economic terms, there's variation in terms of crappy things you don't want in your backyard. And a prison, especially a federal prison, which is what I studied, is at the higher end. And even a private prison is going to be better than a paper mill, if you think about it that way. So that's an empirical question that I'm going to investigate. I just don't see a lot of action there in terms of swapping out like one crappy facility for a prison.
Great, thank you. So moving down to Ashley again. So this is a question from Laura. I'm wondering if you can speak to in-prison research in other countries. Why focus on the US context specifically? What might things look like elsewhere? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a great question. So the reason I'm looking at this is because the 3 original articles and several review articles that came out later, basically all are focused on the US context and often explicitly make the comparison to the very strong literature that's taking place in other countries. So basically, I'm specifically testing that claim in the literature that's been made about the US. That said, I actually did collect dissertations that were all English-based dissertations that were written around the world, most heavily in Canada, the UK, like the UK, broadly speaking, like the whole Upper Island, Australia, India, and a few other countries. One kind of practical component, so I will be, that will be like paper 3 in the series, but one practical issue for doing this analysis is the number of dissertations is completely dwarfed. So I can take that entire data set, and it's about, I would say about a third of the data set that I have now, of the US data sets. Just kind of more qualitatively speaking, like as a researcher who keeps up with the literature coming out of the UK is fantastic. It's been kicking our ass in the US basically for years. It's both empirically rich and theoretically rich, as well as Nordic prisons. There are a number of US scholars who are going to Nordic prisons, and that whole region. So basically other countries' prisons seem to be pretty open. I'm sure there are critiques people could offer about what exactly that openness is, and like what you have to do to get access. But just in terms of what actually gets published, basically these other countries are doing an exceptional job of having that research. So thank you.
Great. So moving to a question for Jonathan and Simon from Justin. So, quote, if the goal of prison scholars is to reduce the use and harms of imprisonment, does it make sense strategically for reformist prison scholars to critique abolitionist interventions, cleavages? Would you like me to read that?
I would need to learn more about sort of the nature of that critique. I mean, I want to pull in, maybe if I could, a question from Marta as well on, that asks about what criminologists today can do to support the abolition movement. So I don't think critiquing it could be part of that, but I certainly, that's not the spirit I bring to thinking about it. I think more important to learn from it. Abolition actually changes in a lot of ways the whole conversation around, quote, prisons and reform, by asking what is it that needs to be reformed? What are the institutions that are actually germane to this? In our general role as, essentially arbiters of governmental knowledge about crime, and often, strategically aligned with the state as a promoter of its legitimacy, I think we have a lot of work to do. I mean, for one thing, as a profession, at least in the United States, we are on record as saying basically criminal justice works. I mean, if you listen to the economists out there who claim to be the ones who can sort of read across all the empirical data, more police, reduce crime, prisons reduce crime, it all works according to them. I think, in fact, there's the evidence is both small in the magnitude of what they're talking about, like, maybe more police contribute 5% or something to crime declines when you have them, but also reflects a remarkably cherry-picked, set of examples. And in the US, criminal justice is hyper-local. So, the fact that Operation Ceasefire worked in a couple of cities means nothing, or CompStat worked in a couple of cities means nothing as to whether it will work in other places. What I don't think we can do anymore in this country, and maybe they can still do in Norway, is be a true kind of moral force of influence on the carceral state that views academia as part of its legitimacy in a rehabilitationist era or in a welfare state era. I think because of penal populism, generally speaking, I think academics are not in a good position to influence directly the penal state, except to help it legitimize itself right now. So I'm pretty skeptical that we can play the role that I think abolitionist criminologists like Madison and Nils Christie did, again, to make Norway's prisons the kind of prisons that people decide we need to fly around the world to look at, because somehow that's compatible with human dignity.
Excellent.
Thank you.
I have a question for John. When you were talking, I was wondering, can we envision other mass building projects for rural areas that might sort of fulfill comparable, financial needs? I mean, the United States has gone through periods of mass buildings of educational institutions, mass buildings of, infrastructure. Is this within the realm of the imaginable, or have those moments passed?
No, I think it's actually, that's the first quote from my key informant, John Alderson, saying, if I had a high-tech, non-polluting facility that paid $100K, this is one of the town fathers, one of the white elites, he'd say, I got the land, I'd give it, right? I'd sell it, right? In the longer version of this presentation and in the book itself, I start writing, I've been writing, incorporating elements of the Green New Deal, or whatever you want to call it, that I think really need to focus on rebuilding rural America. So if that falls under what Jonathan's talking about in terms of the expansion of the welfare state, because I think we believe that rural America is just all white. And actually the highest level of inequality, the highest level of deprivation is in rural America, either on the reservation, the colonias, or in the Black Belt. And that's all racialized too, right? Poor whites' life expectancy is going downhill for the first time in years. White women's life expectancy is slipping. And we see an increase in white incarceration and rural incarceration simultaneously. So we need a number of targeted programs for these for the different types of disadvantage that exist across rural communities. So I think that there was someone, TPC Canada, asked about Canadian communities who are being promised jobs if they if they get prisons in their backyard. And I would say to them, yeah, that's a tough. How are you going to tell folks to say no when they don't have much else and they don't even have the resources? Because it takes money to have you need a chamber of commerce or some other local entity that helps build out your political economy and sell the place and reach out to industry to pull them in. And you just don't, rural America just doesn't have that. Right. So we need to, part of rebuilding the infrastructure of rural America or Canada, anywhere rural, if we want to reduce our over-reliance on prisons, you can't get prisons, you can't take prisons from these communities. These communities, there's a political scientist that shows that if you, communities that have prisons want tougher laws to increase mass incarceration. So unless you provide some other alternatives, we're not going to get below, we're not going to be able to reduce the number of prisons, even as we go to decarcerate. And I think what I showed was that we built our way into this. So regardless, we're going to be stuck with these prisons. So we may even want to come up with alternative uses for those sites. So yeah, no, I'm by no means am I just, I think 5 years ago, I was rather depressed after finishing the first book, thinking there's no way back from this, but I'm seeing glimmers of hope that we can reverse some of these trends.
Excellent. I'm conscious of the time. I just want to ask Ashley one question, probably from a student. I'm not sure, asking about whether you've seen any trends in terms of master's levels research in this area, if that's part of your data set.
Unfortunately, I did not collect any data on the master's theses. I can speculate that because the projects tend to be smaller, they might be more narrowly focused, and so that might be easier to get access. So I can imagine like master's students are also less threatening than say like a PhD student, and also less threatening than faculty. So I'd imagine that the numbers would look different there, where you'd probably get more in prison research. In absolute numbers, I don't know what it would be relative to other topics and whether or not there would be a similar decline, but that would be a very interesting follow-up paper. Thank you very much.
Excellent. So I think let's just finish the panel there. I want to thank everyone virtually. That was great. And I want to just beg everyone's indulgence for a couple minutes. I think we're at the end of the entire event. So I just want to take a couple minutes to sort of thank some people and wrap up. This will not take much time, but this is in some ways the most important. I think the most important thing I should say is that Sandra should be doing this sort of wrap up, but Sandra has another meeting that she sort of has to be at. So most thanks to Sandra for all of her incredible work and visioning this. Thanks to all of the contributors for your presentations that sort of worked incredibly well. We were very worried that the technology might not work. So particularly thanks to Jeff for his incredible hard work making this kind of happen in a actually tremendously seamless fashion for what for me has been the first large online conference. So fantastic. The panels have been well attended. They've been even better observed on YouTube. So please take a look if you've missed any, and they will be up there for several months. They might be something that's of interest to you, your students, whoever the case may be. So take advantage of that. We'll probably send some tweets out about reminding people about the types of topics that are in there. Thanks to David Garland for his kind of insightful and provocative keynote to start the entire endeavor. Thanks to what were really a couple of quite fantastic lived experience panels. And if you didn't get a chance to see the lived experience panels, I think they were both great. I thought yesterday's was really quite fantastic. And if you get a chance, please take a look at that. And I think the last thing I want to say is, please keep us in mind for future collaborations. If you're looking for a place to visit for a sabbatical, or if you're making a cross-country tour across Canada, think about the Center for Criminological Research. That's also true for graduate students who might be watching. There are we do have a graduate program here. Our graduate students, thanks to them, they've been tremendously helpful in making this work and fielding the questions and asking questions. So stay safe. They're strange times, and thanks to everyone.